This is my review of the autobiography of Booker T. Washington, whom I may reference in the more abbreviated fashion as simply Booker Washington. It has been close to 10 years since I first read it. At that time, it was in bits and pieces, due to it being the audio version. And most times I obtained several different books on this at a time, tending to bounce back and forth between them, thereby avoiding the boredom which sets in after spending too much time on one. Plus the fact in this series, it is about the subject of slavery, which coincides with the title, Up from Slavery, even though the book itself is 90% nothing to do with slavery at all, but more so in the years immediately following it, meaning the raising up of the race from bondage, which was a period of Booker Washington. He can talk about it because he was living it, particularly in the South. I might as well say this off the top before I even get to his book review. You're going to know this about me anyway. I might as well own up to it now. And that is, I am a militantist. Not even sure if there is such a word. I'm kind of making it up if it doesn't exist. I'm not even going to bother defining it. You will understand and get what I mean by my views as they come across in this series of clips. That is what I am, a militantist, and I make no apologies about it. As such, reading Up from Slavery by Booker Washington was painful. It hurt. I'm like, what in the world was he thinking when he said some of the things he said? But let me take a step back for a moment, because I'm not here to slam on Booker. This is supposed to be a book review, which means a look at the big picture of him, his life and work. Also, I'm consoled by the fact he was not alone in his thinking. Lots of other colored folk at the time thought exactly the way he did. They just did not write an autobiography the way he did to express it. So without further ado, this is what I have to say about it. First, I want to go back to something I said earlier, how he was a product not only of slavery, but also of a Southern black man. So many of the things he did and tried doing, we have to keep that part in mind, of the happy guy who just wants to get along with everybody, particularly white people. Booker was born a slave, but he experienced emancipation at a young age, so he was not intimately acquainted with the ills of slavery the same as someone like Frederick Douglass was, because Douglass, who was much older, had to escape from slavery and spend a number of years as a fugitive in the North. Also, there have been talk of a so-called rivalry between Booker Washington and Du Bois, which may have existed. There is no talk about any of this in the Washington biography. I'm not going to say a lot about it. That rivalry anyway, because Du Bois was many years younger than Washington. Du Bois was a Northerner and had never been a slave, and hence does not constitute direct involvement on the subject of this series, even though overall I prefer more of Du Bois than I did Washington. This review is about Washington and his time. But I will say this about Frederick Douglass, who I believe was a great man. He was considered to be the most prominent Negro leader of his time. I have read the book he wrote on himself called His Life and Times, which was outstanding as far as I am concerned. It is not Washington's fault that he was considered to be the heir apparent Negro leader after Frederick Douglass. Douglass was a hard act to follow. I don't care who you were. And maybe that is one of the reasons some of the things Washington had to say were so cringeworthy. Because look at who he was coming after. Those who know about Washington know about his Atlanta Exposition speech, which I did not find out about until after reading his book the first time, which was one of the good reasons for me reading it again, because he talks about that speech and the significance of it in his book. I knew how a lot of others felt about it, but I was able to see how he himself thought of it. Up from Slavery by Booker Washington is a book I do not recommend anyone read. There is too much stuff in it that makes my head hurt. He tries to come off as this pillar of humility, yet all you see, especially towards the second half, is self-aggrandizement after self-aggrandizement, such as him saying, "Sometimes I have been criticized by members of my own race, but I have found that with the passage of time, the majority of them have come to agree with the position I took, thereby acknowledging I was right all along." I'm paraphrasing, of course. That is not a direct quote. If everything he said was true, then his time and place was the best of times for black people in the world, and society, particularly in the South, was as colorblind as could be. But here's the point, of which even a guy like me has to acknowledge. Maybe he was a lapdog. Maybe he was going around kissing all the white folks' butt he can get his lips on. But look at what came out of that. Tuskeegee Institute, which would not otherwise be. We as black people of today are so proud of our Tuskeegee Airmen of World War II. Look at where they came from. So while I may not agree with his methods in going about the way he did what he did, or the things he said, we do have a historically black college as a result of it, which I believe deserves support above a lot of other schools, which are not historically black. But you want to know what the real kicker for me about this dude was? At the time he was at the height of his power and influence in the country was when the Supreme Court handed its decision down in the case of Plessy versus Ferguson, which in my opinion was by far the most consequential Supreme Court decision ever, because that was the decision which made separate but equal the law of the land. Anybody who knows anything about black history will readily discuss with you the Dred Scott decision and aftermath which came before Plessy, or the Brown versus Board of Education which came along many years after Plessy. But Plessy versus Ferguson had to have been powerful to have lasted as long as it did. And when it was handed down, there was not a lot of white people up in arms about it. And if you go back to that decision, you can't do what you did with the Dred Scott decision, where you can point to the Chief Justice as the bad guy. In Plessy, they all said yes to it, with the exception of one guy. Take a moment and let that sink in, realizing this was the climate the country was living in. And you've got a guy like Booker Washington standing up and shouting from the rooftop, protesting voting rights and other protections under the law? It ain't me, buddy. I just want us all to get along at any cost. I would really like to find a book to read on him and his life, written by someone other than himself. I know they are around because I have seen them in bookstores, but they have always been the books that you read and that you have to pay for. So at least for the time being, my knowledge of this particular individual will continue to remain limited as it has always been.